Part 2. The wind outside howled like an ancient beast, and the windows rattled with the force of the storm. Inside the small cabin, the three friends huddled together, trying to gather their scattered nerves. The last few hours had been a blur of fear, confusion, and adrenaline. The thing outside, the creature, the Bigfoot, had been so close, so real, that none of them could deny it any longer. Lucy rubbed her arms, her fingers numb from the cold. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing up, as though the creature's gaze was still upon them. She glanced around the dimly lit cabin, trying to force herself to relax. Ben sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, his eyes fixed on the door. "It's gone for now," he said, though his voice betrayed the doubt that lingered in his mind. "But I don't think we're safe. Not yet." Jacques, sitting at the window, nodded grimly. "It's out there. I can feel it. Watching, waiting." He was staring out at the thick snowstorm, which had only intensified in the last hour. The world outside was a white blur, the visibility so poor that they couldn't see past a few feet. They were trapped. The creature, whatever it was, had been pacing around the cabin for hours, growling and scraping its massive claws against the walls. They could hear its breath, heavy and ragged, like a predator's growl. But now there was nothing. The noises had stopped. It was almost too quiet. Lucy shuddered and turned to Jacques, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it's gone?" Jacques didn't answer immediately. He was still watching the swirling snow outside, his breath fogging up the window. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and tense. "I don't know, but I don't think it's leaving us alone for good." Ben stood up and walked over to the door, checking that it was still locked. It was a futile gesture, given how easily the creature could have torn the door down if it had wanted to, but it gave him a small sense of control. "We need to figure out what to do," he said. "We can't stay in here forever." Lucy turned to face them, her eyes wide with fear. "We don't have much of a choice. It's not like we can just walk out there with that thing lurking around. We need to wait for the storm to pass, and then maybe we can find a way to get help." They all knew it was a lie, but they had no other option. They had to wait. Hours passed. The wind raged outside, but the growls of the creature never returned. It was as though it had simply vanished into the storm, leaving the three friends in a tense, uneasy silence. They listened for any sounds of movement, but all they heard was the howl of the wind and the creaking of the old cabin. Lucy felt like she was losing her mind. She was so tired, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the creature's massive form looming outside, its dark eyes glowing in the night. She couldn't stop imagining what it would be like if it broke through the door, if it tore them apart. Ben, too, seemed to be losing patience. He had always been the one to keep the group together, the one to calm them down in moments of panic. But now, he was just as scared as the others. "I think it's gone," he said, his voice barely audible. "At least for now. We should try to sleep." But none of them could sleep. The storm raged outside, the world a blur of snow and wind, and they could only wait. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, the silence was broken. A loud thud echoed against the cabin, followed by a deep, guttural growl that sent a shock of fear straight through their spines. The creature was back. This time, however, the sound was farther away. It wasn't at the door. It was out in the woods. It seemed to be retreating, moving deeper into the storm. But they knew better than to let their guard down. The creature was still out there, watching. The minutes stretched into hours, and the three friends sat in tense silence, barely daring to move. The wind outside howled like a wild animal, a constant reminder of the storm's power, but the creature's growls had faded into the distance. It had retreated, or at least that's what they hoped. Lucy shivered, not from the cold, but from the sheer uncertainty of it all. She glanced over at Ben, who was sitting with his back pressed against the cabin wall, his hands clenched tightly around his knees. He didn't look at her, and neither did Jacques, who had long since become lost in his own thoughts. The cabin was stifling, the air thick with the smell of sweat and fear. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind, made them jump. It felt as though the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Do you think we're safe?" Lucy whispered, though she wasn't sure she wanted an answer. Ben turned his head slightly, his eyes hollow from exhaustion. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think we're safe. Not yet." Jacques finally spoke, his voice low and grim. "It's been quiet for too long. It feels like it's just waiting for us to make a mistake." The tension in the room grew heavier, and Lucy's thoughts started to spiral. What if the creature wasn't leaving at all? What if it was simply toying with them, letting them think it was gone before it came for them in the dead of night? She shook her head, trying to push the thought away. She had to stay strong. They all did. "What if we just leave?" she suggested, her voice hesitant. "I mean, it's still storming outside, but maybe we could wait for the storm to die down, and then we can leave. Head to the nearest town for help." Ben shook his head immediately. "We don't know where it is, Lucy, and it's not just the creature. This storm is a monster of its own. Even if we could get away, we wouldn't last long out there." Lucy bit her lip, trying to suppress the rising panic. The storm was a constant threat, and the creature was a much larger one. They were stuck, caught between two dangers. They all fell silent again, the oppressive stillness of the cabin weighing down on them. For the first time since they had arrived, Lucy realized how truly isolated they were. No one was coming for them. They had no way of contacting the outside world, and the storm had trapped them here, in the middle of nowhere, with something far more terrifying than they had ever imagined. Just as she was about to speak again, a loud bang echoed through the cabin, followed by a scraping sound at the door. Her heart stopped. She froze, barely daring to breathe. Jacques was the first to move. He grabbed a small, rusty crowbar from the corner and cautiously approached the door, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't say a word. There was no need. They all knew what it was. The creature was back. They could hear it, breathing heavily on the other side of the door. The scraping continued, like claws dragging against the wood, leaving deep marks. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Lucy's blood ran cold. What was it waiting for? "Stay quiet," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. He was standing near the window now, his eyes scanning the snow-covered landscape outside, as if searching for some sign of the creature's movements. They waited, and waited. The minutes dragged on like hours. The storm continued to rage, but the scraping noises had stopped. They dared not move, not even a whisper. Finally, just as hope began to dwindle, Jacques let out a shaky breath and backed away from the door. "I don't think it's here anymore." But the doubt in his voice was unmistakable. None of them believed it for a second. They had survived another night, but they all knew one thing. The creature wasn't done with them. Not yet. It was still out there, waiting. The morning light barely filtered through the thick clouds, casting an eerie gray glow over the snow-covered wilderness. The storm had calmed, but the oppressive atmosphere that lingered felt like an omen. Inside the cabin, the three friends sat in tense silence, each one weighed down by their own thoughts. The worst part was the uncertainty. They had no idea whether the creature had truly left or if it was just biding its time. Lucy was the first to break the silence. "We can't just sit here and wait for it to come back. We need to figure out a plan." Her voice cracked slightly, but she tried to sound more confident than she felt. Ben looked up from the window where he had been staring into the swirling snow. "What kind of plan? The storm has passed, but we're still stuck. We don't know if that thing is gone or if it's just waiting for the right moment to strike again." Jacques stood up, pacing the room. "We need to get out of here. We've been stuck in this cabin for too long. We need help, and we need to get to safety." He turned to Ben. "If we don't leave now, we might not have another chance." Lucy nodded in agreement. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had to act before it was too late. "We can't just keep hiding. We've been trapped here for days. We need to find a way out, even if it means walking through the storm." Ben frowned, but didn't argue. He knew they were right. They couldn't stay in the cabin forever, waiting for something that might never come. But they also couldn't leave without knowing whether the creature was still out there. "We'll wait a bit longer," Ben said after a moment. "But not much longer. If we don't see any sign of it in the next few hours, we'll leave." The decision was made, but none of them felt completely at ease. Every minute they spent in the cabin brought more uncertainty. As the hours passed, the sky outside grew darker, and the wind began to pick up once more. The storm was returning. The snow swirled in thick gusts, obscuring the landscape, but there was still no sign of the creature. Lucy kept herself busy by rummaging through their supplies. It wasn't much, some canned food, bottled water, and a few extra blankets. She had to keep moving. Sitting idle only made her feel more anxious. Jacques was staring out the window, his eyes narrowed as if trying to spot something, anything, in the white expanse. "Do you think it's still out there?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Lucy replied. "But if it is, we need to be ready." Ben finally stood and walked over to the small table, pulling out a map from their bag. He spread it out on the table, tracing the route they had taken to the cabin. "We need to get back to the main road. That's our only chance. If we can make it there, we can get help." They all gathered around the table, looking at the map. The nearest town was several miles away, but getting there wasn't going to be easy, especially with the storm picking up again. The snow was already starting to fall heavier, and the wind was biting. They would need to be careful. Ben looked at them both. "We can't waste time. If we don't leave now, we'll be trapped again, and who knows if we'll survive another night here." Jacques nodded grimly. "Let's do it then. We don't have a choice." Lucy took a deep breath. "All right, let's stick together and keep moving. We'll make it through this." They gathered their things, what little they could carry, and opened the cabin door. The wind hit them instantly, cold and unforgiving, but there was no turning back. They stepped out into the snow, the sound of their boots crunching underfoot swallowed by the howling wind. As they trudged forward, the wind picked up even more, driving the snow into their faces. The storm had returned with a vengeance. Every step felt like a battle. But they pressed on, determined to find safety. In the distance, they thought they saw something large moving through the snow. For a moment, their hearts skipped a beat. But as they looked closer, it was nothing more than a snowdrift. Yet the feeling of being watched never left. It was as if the creature was always just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. And they couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The storm raged around them, but the friends continued on, determined to put as much distance between themselves and the cabin as possible. The snow whipped at their faces, stinging their skin, and the wind howled like a wild animal. They had no choice but to push forward, trusting that the worst of the danger was behind them. But in the back of their minds, a nagging fear lingered. Had the creature really left, or was it still out there, lurking just beyond their sight? As they trudged through the snow, Lucy kept glancing over her shoulder. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. The silence of the forest was unsettling, broken only by the sound of the wind and their own footsteps crunching through the snow. It was too quiet, too empty. "Do you think it's gone?" Lucy asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Ben didn't answer immediately. He was focused on the path ahead, but his eyes were constantly flicking from side to side, searching for any sign of movement. "I don't know," he said finally. "It might be, but I don't think we can afford to let our guard down." Jacques, who had been walking in the rear, suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. They all stopped, straining their ears. The wind howled, but there was something else, an almost imperceptible sound, like something large moving through the snow just outside their range of vision. Lucy's heart skipped a beat. "It's him," she whispered, her breath coming out in visible puffs. Ben turned to look at her, his face pale. "Stay calm," he said, his voice tense. "We need to keep moving." They began walking faster, their steps quickening as they moved through the snow. But the sound followed them, growing louder with each step. It was unmistakable now. There was something out there, something large and moving toward them. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted. They were standing on a thin layer of snow that covered a deep ravine, and before anyone could react, the snow beneath Jacques' feet gave way. He let out a strangled cry as he tumbled forward, disappearing into the snow below. "Jacques!" Lucy screamed, her heart racing. Without hesitation, Ben and Lucy rushed to the edge of the ravine, peering into the snow below. Jacques was sprawled in the deep snow, but he was alive, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he scrambled to stand. "Are you all right?" Ben shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Jacques grunted, shaking the snow from his clothes. "I'm fine, I think," he said, though his voice was strained. "Just a little shaken up." "We need to get you out of there," Lucy said urgently. "Hurry." They reached down to help him, but the ground around the ravine was unstable. Ben grasped Joc's outstretched hand, pulling with all his strength. With one final heave, they managed to get him back up to solid ground, but their relief was short-lived. From the trees behind them, a low growl rumbled through the air. It was the creature. It was closer now, and they could hear the unmistakable sound of massive footsteps crunching through the snow. "Run!" Ben shouted. Without another word, they all took off, sprinting through the snow as fast as their legs would carry them. The wind howled in their ears, but they couldn't stop. They didn't dare stop. Behind them, they could hear the creature's footsteps growing louder, its growls cutting through the howling wind. It was getting closer. Lucy's heart pounded in her chest as she pushed herself harder, her breath coming in quick, ragged gasps. The snow was thick and heavy, her legs burned, but she couldn't slow down. Not now. Not with that thing following them. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from behind them, branches snapping and a roar so loud it nearly shook the ground beneath their feet. Without warning, the creature burst from the trees, its massive form crashing into the snow. It was impossibly large, its fur matted with snow and ice. Its eyes glowed a faint yellow in the dim light, and its mouth was open in a terrifying snarl, showing rows of sharp teeth. The snowman, Bigfoot, was faster than they had expected. "Go!" Ben yelled, his voice desperate. "We need to get to the road, now!" But as they turned to run, the creature let out another roar, this one deafening, and they knew they had no time left. They had no choice but to make a stand. The roar of Bigfoot had barely faded when the three friends found themselves frozen in the snow, adrenaline coursing through their veins, but their bodies utterly drained. The creature had disappeared into the forest as quickly as it had appeared, vanishing without a trace. It was as though the terrifying presence that had haunted them for days was suddenly gone. Lucy's breath came in short, shallow bursts, her chest tight with fear. She glanced over at Ben and Jack, both of them equally exhausted, their faces pale and drawn. They were standing on unsteady legs, the weight of the chase and the fear catching up with them. "What just happened?" Lucy whispered, her voice hoarse. "Where did it go?" Ben shook his head, unable to answer. His mind raced with the same questions. It didn't make sense. The creature had been right behind them, almost upon them, and then, nothing. It was gone. "We can't keep going like this," Jacques said, his voice weak. He swayed on his feet, struggling to stay upright. "We're too far from the road. We're not going to make it in this condition." Ben and Lucy exchanged a glance. They knew he was right. Their legs were numb from the cold, their energy drained by the terror and the sprint through the snow. The road seemed impossibly far away, and every step felt like it might be their last. "We need to find shelter," Lucy said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "Somewhere we can rest. Somewhere safe." Ben nodded. They didn't have the strength to continue running. They needed to regroup, to think. The road might still be their destination, but it was too far to reach in their current state. "Let's find somewhere," Ben agreed, scanning the snow-covered landscape. There was no telling how far the creature might have gone, or if it would return. They needed a place to hide, somewhere they could at least take a breath and recover. They turned toward the forest, hoping to find a secluded spot. They moved cautiously, sticking close together, not daring to venture too far in any direction. The storm had not let up, and the cold was biting at their skin, making it hard to focus. Their vision blurred by the snow and wind, but they pressed on, determined to find something, anything that could offer them a chance to survive this nightmare. It wasn't long before Jacques spotted something ahead, what looked like the remnants of an old, weathered building. The walls were half collapsed, and the roof was partially covered with snow, but it looked like it might provide the shelter they needed. "Over there," Jacques pointed weakly. "It's better than nothing." Without waiting for a response, the three of them moved toward the structure. As they drew closer, the door creaked open, and they stepped inside, grateful for the temporary reprieve from the storm. The interior was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The walls, once sturdy, were now bowed and rotting, and the floor creaked beneath their feet as they moved further inside. But it was shelter, something they hadn't had in what felt like hours. They huddled together in the center of the room, their breath coming in visible puffs as they tried to warm themselves against the bitter cold. "This will have to do," Ben muttered, sinking to the floor with a heavy sigh. Lucy wrapped her arms around herself, trying to conserve heat. "Do you think it's gone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jock leaned against the wall, exhausted and defeated. "I don't know, but we can't keep running forever." They all fell silent for a long moment, the weight of their situation settling in. The storm outside continued to howl, but inside the shelter, it was eerily quiet. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving them feeling drained, fragile, and vulnerable. For the first time in what felt like days, there was a brief sense of peace. They didn't have to run. They didn't have to fight. They were hidden. But deep down, they all knew it wouldn't last. They didn't know if Bigfoot was out there, waiting for them, or if the worst was yet to come. The danger was still very real, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down. Not yet. The fire flickered weakly in the corner of the room, casting long, trembling shadows across the decaying walls. The warmth from the flames was comforting, though it did little to ease the tension that still gripped Lucy, Ben, and Jock. They huddled close, their backs against the cold stone walls, trying to gather what little strength they had left. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, something unusual caught their attention. On the walls surrounding them were strange, hastily drawn images, graffiti sprayed in crude, messy strokes of white and red. The drawings were unsettling, almost surreal in their simplicity, but there was no mistaking what they depicted. Large, monstrous hands, twisted, elongated figures with massive eyes, and Bigfoot. Lucy's breath caught in her throat as she moved closer to inspect the nearest one. The creature was unmistakable. Its large, hulking figure, towering over everything in sight, was drawn with unnerving detail. But what truly shocked them was the positioning of the graffiti. It wasn't just random. It seemed to be marking the territory of something. "Do you think," Ben started, his voice trailing off as he examined the walls, "we're not the first ones to encounter it?" Lucy swallowed, her heart pounding faster. She crouched down to get a better look at the figure, then slowly turned to Jacques and Ben. "I think we're not the only ones who've been hunted by it." Jacques rubbed his hand across his face, exhausted, but now even more unsettled by what they were seeing. Someone else must have come here before us, and they didn't make it out. The air in the room felt heavier, the walls closing in on them with every passing second. The eerie drawings covered nearly every surface, on the ceiling, along the walls, even near the windows. Some scratched with sharp tools, others hastily spray-painted in neon colors. The images of Bigfoot were everywhere. Lucy knelt down, her fingers tracing the rough edges of one drawing. It wasn't just a picture. It was a message, a warning. The lines of the creature's body were drawn with urgency, like the artist had seen it up close. Some drawings were even accompanied by phrases or marks, but they were nearly unreadable, as though smeared by time and exposure to the elements. "Do you think the people who stayed here before, they didn't just disappear? What if they—" Ben's voice faltered, the implications too much to bear. "I don't know," Lucy said quietly, trying to steady her racing thoughts. "But there's a reason for these markings. These people, they were trying to communicate. And maybe—" She stopped, her throat tightening as she imagined the worst. Maybe they tried to warn anyone else who might come here. Jacques stood up suddenly, his eyes scanning the room more urgently now. "If they saw Bigfoot, if they were here before us—" He trailed off, a sudden fear settling over him. "What if we're next?" There was a long silence, the weight of the graffiti and the terrifying possibilities hanging in the air. The fire crackled and popped, the only sound breaking the tense stillness. "We can't stay here forever," Ben said, his voice firm despite the dread creeping into his chest. "We have to keep moving. We need to get back to the road, to safety." Lucy nodded, though she didn't fully believe their chances of escaping this nightmare. Her mind raced, wondering just how many others had stayed in this very spot, only to be hunted down by the very creature they had been warned about. The graffiti was undeniable. It wasn't just a coincidence. "We're not the only ones," she repeated, her voice shaky. "And I don't think we'll be the last." Outside, the storm continued to howl, the wind battering the windows, as if trying to force them out. They were trapped, both by the storm and the shadow of what lay in the forest, watching them. Jacques turned back to the fire. "We can't keep going like this, not with Bigfoot out there." They all stared into the flames for a moment, lost in their thoughts. It was clear now. Bigfoot wasn't just some local legend. It wasn't a myth or a story to scare tourists. It was real. And somehow, they had stumbled right into its territory. The fire crackled and hissed as the wind howled through the cracks in the decaying walls, rattling the windows. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. It was as if the mountain itself had become an unwelcoming entity, pushing them deeper into its dark heart. They sat around the fire, the eerie silence hanging heavily between them. The weight of their situation pressed down on their shoulders, and the looming question hung in the air. What now? Lucy was the first to break the silence. "We can't just sit here," she said, her voice low and strained. "We need to find a way out. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes. Bigfoot's not going to stop just because we're hiding." Ben nodded, his face pale from both fear and exhaustion. "But where do we go? We're surrounded by nothing but snow and trees. The road is far, and with this storm, we don't have a choice." Jacques interrupted, his voice harsh. "If we don't try to get out, we're going to end up like those people who came before us. Those drawings, they weren't just for decoration. They were a warning. If we wait too long, we won't be the only ones who disappear." His words sent a chill down Lucy's spine. She had been trying to avoid thinking about the implications of the graffiti, but it was impossible to ignore now. Someone had been here before them, and they hadn't left. Whatever had happened to them, they were now part of the same grim story. And now, it seemed, they were the next chapter. "We need to move. We can't stay here, hoping the storm will let up," Lucy continued, standing up and brushing the snow off her jacket. "We can't keep waiting for a miracle." Ben looked up, eyes filled with uncertainty. "But if we leave, we're walking straight into Bigfoot's territory. We're just putting ourselves in more danger." "Maybe," Lucy agreed, "but staying here isn't an option. We have to get to the road. We've got a better chance if we're out in the open, where we can see if it's near." Jacques turned to Ben. "We're running out of options. We can't just wait to be found. I say we move now, while we still have some daylight left." Ben hesitated, his eyes darting between the two of them. The fear was evident in his face, but there was something else too: determination. He knew they couldn't sit idly by any longer. He stood up slowly, pulling on his jacket. "All right, let's go. But we need to be quick and quiet. If Bigfoot's out there, we can't let it hear us." The decision was made. There was no more time for second-guessing or indecision. They grabbed their packs and headed toward the door, hearts pounding in their chests. The moment they stepped outside, the cold air hit them like a slap to the face. The snow had piled up higher than they'd expected, and the visibility was near zero. The wind howled as it whipped around them, stinging their skin and making every step feel like an eternity. For a moment, they all stood still, the weight of their situation pressing heavily on them. Bigfoot wasn't just a creature of myth. It was real, and it was watching them. The fear of the unknown gripped them tightly, but there was no turning back. They had to keep moving. The trees loomed like silent sentinels around them as they trudged through the deep snow. Every crackling branch, every rustling leaf sent a jolt of terror through their bodies. They kept their voices low, trying to stay as quiet as possible, though the howling wind made it difficult to hear anything beyond the storm. As they moved, Lucy glanced nervously over her shoulder. The shadows seemed to dance in the corners of her vision, and every shadow looked like it could be something else, something watching them. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she quickened her pace, trying to ignore the sense of being followed. Ben noticed her nervous glance and slowed down. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I don't know," she whispered, her breath coming out in puffs of mist. I feel like we're being watched." They all stopped, the weight of her words sinking in. The wind howled around them, but for a split second, the forest seemed to go silent. No animal sounds, no distant rustling. Just the eerie stillness that seemed to close in on them. Jacques looked around nervously. "It's just the storm," he said, though his voice betrayed the doubt in his words. Lucy wasn't so sure. "I don't think so. I feel like it's waiting for us." Suddenly, a distant guttural noise cut through the silence, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the trees. They froze. The air felt thick with tension. "It's him," Ben said, barely a whisper, his eyes wide with fear. The sound grew louder, closer. There was no mistaking it now. The creature they had been dreading was out there, moving closer, its presence like a heavy shadow that pressed in on them. Without another word, they broke into a run, stumbling through the deep snow, desperate to put as much distance between them and the creature as possible. But the wind and the storm made it nearly impossible to see where they were going, and they had no choice but to keep moving blindly. They had no idea how much time had passed or how far they had gone. But one thing was clear: they weren't alone, and Bigfoot was closing in on them. The sound of Bigfoot's massive steps was growing closer, echoing through the trees like a thunderous heartbeat. Lucy's breath was coming in short, shallow gasps as she stumbled through the snow, trying to push her body forward despite the exhaustion setting in. The storm was relentless, whipping the snow around them in blinding flurries, making it even harder to see. "We can't outrun it," Ben yelled, his voice full of panic. He was struggling to keep up, his legs heavy with fatigue. They had been running for what felt like hours, but the creature was closing in with every step. Lucy turned her head back for just a moment, and that's when she saw it. Bigfoot was enormous, its massive hairy form looming through the snow, its glowing eyes locked onto them with terrifying focus. It wasn't just a predator, it was relentless. "We need to find shelter," Jacques said urgently, his voice strained as he glanced around. But all they saw was a wall of trees and snow, the landscape as desolate and inhospitable as it had been since they started this nightmare. Just then, something caught their attention, a flicker of light in the distance. It was faint, but there, shining through the snow. It wasn't the eerie glow of Bigfoot's eyes. No, this was different. Headlights, a car, a vehicle on the road. It had to be. "We have to make it to the road." This Lucy said through clenched teeth, her eyes desperate. "If we can just get to that road, maybe the driver will help us." They pushed harder, their bodies screaming in protest as they pushed through the snow, the sound of Bigfoot's footsteps still behind them, growing louder with every second. "Almost there," Jacques gasped, his voice shaky. His eyes were fixed on the faint glow of the headlights, still some distance away, but getting closer. But as they neared the road, the creature wasn't far behind them. Its breath came in great, heavy bursts, and with every step, the ground beneath them shook. Lucy's heart raced in her chest. They couldn't stop. They had to make it to that road. The headlights of the car grew brighter, closer. She could hear the sound of the engine now, a loud hum that pierced through the storm. It was so close, they were almost there. But just as they reached the edge of the trees, a distant howl from behind them made them stop in their tracks. Bigfoot was closing in fast. "No, no, no," Ben muttered, his eyes wide with fear as he looked at the approaching headlights. They weren't going to make it. Not in time. The growl of Bigfoot became louder, and Lucy felt a wave of panic wash over her. But in the distance, the sound of the vehicle's engine roared louder, and the car's headlights flashed brightly, cutting through the storm like a beacon. In the blink of an eye, the creature hesitated. The bright lights from the approaching vehicle must have distracted it. Bigfoot halted for a moment, its massive frame looming ominously, as if it was uncertain what this new threat was. And that was when they saw it. A narrow road, barely visible beneath the snow, winding through the forest. The car was only seconds away, but Bigfoot still hadn't made a move forward. "Now!" Jacques shouted, his voice shaking. "We have to go!" They sprinted as fast as they could, their hearts pounding in their chests as they made one final, desperate dash for safety. But before they could make it onto the road, the creature let out a terrifying roar. Bigfoot stopped in its tracks, as if considering what to do next. Lucy, Ben, and Jacques reached the edge of the road, but the car was too far away to help them now. The headlights seemed to flicker in the storm, the driver unaware of the danger just ahead. But the distraction had worked. Bigfoot had backed off, just for a moment. It was a small victory, a brief respite in their nightmare. The creature didn't retreat completely. It remained hidden in the trees, but the sound of its growls faded as it watched them from the shadows. Breathing heavily, the three friends stood at the edge of the road, their bodies frozen from fear and the cold. They could still hear the distant sound of the car's engine, the headlights growing faint as it continued on its way. Bigfoot hadn't given up, not yet, but for now, It seemed to be waiting. The storm continued to rage around them, but Lucy, Ben, and Jacques knew they had to make a decision. They had a moment to regroup, to think, before Bigfoot came for them again. "What now?" Ben whispered, his voice trembling. "We need to move," Lucy said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "We need to find shelter, somewhere safe." But they knew it wouldn't be easy. The storm was still fierce, and Bigfoot was still out there, watching them from the trees. They turned, stepping away from the road, their steps heavy as they moved deeper into the forest. It was their only choice for now. And though the creature had momentarily backed off, they knew the terror wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The storm was relentless, biting at their skin and blurring their vision. The wind howled around them, a constant, chilling force that made every step feel like a battle. Despite the momentary reprieve, the fear still gripped them tightly. Bigfoot hadn't gone. It was only waiting for the right moment to strike again. "Where do we go?" Jacques whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. His eyes darted around, scanning the trees, desperate for anything that could offer some kind of protection. Lucy, Ben, and Jacques had little choice but to keep moving. The road, though it had momentarily distracted Bigfoot, was now far behind them, and the shadows of the trees seemed to grow thicker the further they ventured into the forest. They couldn't risk staying in the open, especially with Bigfoot still in pursuit. They needed shelter, and fast. "I think I saw something earlier," Ben said, his voice hoarse. "A building. It was far, but there was a structure. Maybe it's our only shot." Lucy nodded, her face pale but determined. "Lead the way, Ben." The three of them pushed on, stumbling through the snow, their legs aching, their bodies cold and exhausted. The storm made it hard to tell how much time had passed, but it felt like hours. They barely spoke as they trudged on, only the sounds of their footsteps and the storm breaking the silence. And then, through the snow, they saw it, a dark silhouette rising from the trees ahead. It was an old building, its roof sagging with years of neglect. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. They could only pray that the shelter would hold against whatever horrors the night would bring. They approached cautiously, glancing over their shoulders to make sure Bigfoot wasn't closing in. But the forest around them seemed eerily still. The only sound was the wind howling through the trees. They couldn't hear Bigfoot's footsteps anymore. For now, it seemed they had evaded the creature. Once inside the building, they were immediately struck by the oppressive silence. The air was cold, but not as cold as outside. Snow had blown in through broken windows, and the floor was covered with dust and debris. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the dim light from the storm outside filtered in through the cracks in the walls. Is this really the place we want to hide in?" Jacques asked, his voice uncertain as he looked around at the decaying interior. "It's the best we've got," Lucy replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We'll make do." They found a small room near the back of the building, away from the broken windows and exposed walls. They huddled together in the center of the room, trying to keep their bodies warm as the cold seeped into their bones. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The storm raged outside, but the sounds of Bigfoot's pursuit seemed to fade into the distance. They had made it to safety, at least for the time being. But that didn't mean they were safe. Not by a long shot. The flickering light from a nearby fire, built from the dry wood they found scattered around, cast long shadows across the walls. It wasn't much, but it provided some comfort. "I thought we were done for," Ben said, breaking the silence. His voice was shaky, his nerves clearly still on edge. "That thing was so close. I don't know how we outran it." Lucy nodded slowly. "We got lucky. Bigfoot's not going to give up. Not yet." She couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was out there, waiting for them to slip up. But for now, they had a brief respite. The three friends sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly as the wind howled outside. But the stillness was broken when a faint sound cut through the air. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't Bigfoot's growl. It was something else, something that made their blood run cold. A low, guttural growl, so deep it vibrated in their chests, came from somewhere deep within the shadows of the building. Their hearts stopped, their eyes locked with fear. Bigfoot hadn't left. It had found them again. The growl had shaken them to the core. It was unlike any animal sound they had heard before, a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to shake the very walls of the small, abandoned house. It came from somewhere near the front of the cabin, too close, too real to ignore. For a few moments, none of them dared to speak. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside, now intensified by the storm that continued to batter the cabin. Each of them had their eyes fixed on the shadows in the corners of the room, their breath shallow as they waited for the next sound. It came. A heavy thud, like something large shifting in the snow just outside. The floorboards creaked as though someone was moving just outside, walking around the cabin. Lucy's voice broke the silence, barely above a whisper. "Did you hear that? It's still out there, isn't it?" Ben nodded slowly, his face pale. "Yeah, I heard it. It's closer now." Jacques clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. His heart raced, and he was certain it was the creature again, drawing closer. "We need to be ready. Whatever happens next, we have to stay calm." The three of them sat in tense silence, listening to the creaking of the building, the howling wind outside, and that occasional, unnerving sound of something large moving in the snow just outside the cabin. Then, all of a sudden, the sound stopped. Complete silence. No more footsteps. No more growls. Minutes passed, but the silence held. The trio exchanged uneasy glances. "Do you think it's gone?" Lucy asked, her voice barely audible. Ben shook his head. "I don't know. It's not like it to just leave. It's probably waiting for us to slip up." Jacques leaned against the wall, rubbing his temples. "I can't take much more of this. I don't know how long we can keep this up." The fire flickered in the corner of the room, its warmth a faint comfort compared to the cold dread that filled the air. There was a part of them, deep down, that knew they couldn't stay hidden here forever. Sooner or later, they'd have to leave the cabin. Lucy broke the silence again. "What if it's still watching us? What if it's just waiting for us to make a move?" Ben exhaled slowly, his gaze still fixed on the door. "It's possible, but we're not going to know unless we do something." The tension in the room grew with each passing minute as the fire burned lower and the night pressed on. They had no way of knowing how much time had passed, and the quiet outside made them nervous, as if the world were holding its breath. Suddenly, a sound pierced the stillness. The low hum of something in the distance. The unmistakable sound of an engine, like a vehicle moving through the storm. For a moment, they all froze. The sound was faint, barely audible above the wind and snow, but it was there. A vehicle. A lifeline? Lucy stood up quickly. "It's a car! Someone's out there!" But before they could make a move, the engine cut off, and the silence once again enveloped them. Ben's face fell. "We need to be sure it wasn't just our imagination." They waited for any sign that the vehicle might be closer, but the sound didn't come back. Was it still out there? Had the creature retreated again? The uncertainty hung heavily in the air, making each breath feel like an eternity. The trio sat in the darkened cabin, waiting in silence, the weight of the situation settling deep into their bones. They had been so close to help, yet the storm and the creature seemed to keep them trapped. As the night dragged on, the unease grew. No more sounds came from outside. No more growls, no more steps. But they all knew that silence could be just as dangerous as any noise. They could only wait and pray that they would survive the night. End of part 2.